The dramatic events of Stanisław August's reign saw the implementation of many republican postulates. Russian intervention, supposedly on behalf of religious dissidents, led to the distinction in law between immutable cardinal laws, matters of state, including new taxes and the state of the army, that required unanimity, and economic matters which could be decided by majority vote. After the first partition, the king lost most of his powers of patronage and was hamstrung by a permanent council elected by the Sejm from both among senators and envoys, and that took over much of his prerogative. However, the fact that these innovations were imposed by Russia, and that Stanisław August then managed to establish a working relationship with the Russian ambassador, to the fury of magnate families who hoped to outbid him in St. Petersburg, ensured that self-styled republicans drew little satisfaction from these changes. Moreover, the 1780s saw a strong reaction to the enlightened criticism of noble foibles and prejudices as Sarmatism in the name of traditional values. The republican country was mobilized against the royal court. For these and other reasons, the king soon lost control once Russia was seen to be preoccupied with the war against the Ottoman Empire. The Sejm of 1788 was able to make decisions because it was confederated. A confederacy was a league of nobles formed in a national emergency to defend the Commonwealth and its liberty. Many of the usual niceties, such as the liberal veto, were set aside. So, a confederated Sejm could decide by majority, if necessary, if unanimity were not forthcoming. The Sejm could therefore take direct control of the army, state finances, and the nascent diplomatic service, would introduce double taxation on the clergy compared to the nobility, and establish commissions for local government in the localities. The tendency of the first half of the 4-year Sejm was distinctly republican. However, by the middle of 1790, the victorious republican opposition to the court had split. It was clear that without the cooperation of the monarch, it would not be possible to establish a comprehensive republican form of government. The last straw for the leader of the more enlightened republicans in the Sejm, Ignacy Potocki, came when most of the Sejmics held in November 1790 not only rejected the idea of hereditary succession to the throne, but also pungently criticised the educational reforms that he had done so much to advance. They called for the educational fund to be turned over to the army. At least in the short term, concluded Potocki, limited monarchy would be preferable to noble democracy. He swallowed his pride and invited Stanisław August to take the lead in drafting a new constitution for the Commonwealth. The outcome of their negotiations was the law on government, acclaimed by the Sejm on the 3rd of May 1791. What then was the content of the constitution? The law on government has a preamble and 11 articles. The first article concerns religion, the next 3 the rights of the nobles, burghers, and peasants, and the next 4 deal with the form of government. The 2 after that deal with the arrangements for regency and the education of royal children, and the final article is about the armed forces. In social terms, the most important element of the Constitution is the inclusive concept of the nation, which is no longer restricted to the nobility. With regard to the form of government, the key article of the Constitution is the 5th. It summarises and justifies the following 3 articles, respectively dealing with the legislative, executive, and judicial powers and the relations between them. On the one hand, we have a ringing declaration that all power in civil society should be derived from the will of the nation. Now, this may well partly be a nod to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who exercised a dynamic influence on Polish Republican thought in the previous 2 decades following his considerations on the government of Poland, which were published in a Polish translation in 1789. But this statement of the principle of national sovereignty is also a fundamental tenet of Polish republicanism, a tenet that contributed to Rousseau's very popularity in Poland. Article 5 then changes tack somewhat. Its end being the preservation and integrity of the state, the civil liberty and the good order of society on an equal scale and on a lasting foundation. 3 distinct powers shall compose the government of the Polish nation, according to the present constitution, viz. First, legislative power in the states assembled. Second, executive power in the king and council of inspection. Third, judicial power in jurisdictions to be established. Now this is a much clearer borrowing, this time from Charles-Louis de Montesquieu's concept of the separation of powers. But the accompanying aims are a reflection of the political discussions of Stanisław August's reign. The emphasis on the integrity of the state was a belated reaction to the first partition of 1772 and the threat of a further one. Civil or civic liberty was not necessarily either the positive freedom to participate in politics or the negative freedom from intervention, but encompassed both. The good order of society could refer to the need to ensure that the unprivileged orders knew their place and kept it, but it also concerns the need for the rule of law. This element had been a key element of royalist discourse during the 1770s and 1780s. It appealed to the resentment felt by moderately wealthy noblemen against the abuses perpetrated by magnates. Its emphasis on the tranquil and secure enjoyment of liberty and property was strongly influenced by Montesquieu's analysis of despotism. The understanding of liberty put forward by the royalists was closer to a liberal than to a republican idea of freedom. The legislature was the first among the 3 powers. It was given rights to scrutinise and correct the acts of the executive, whose ministers and commissioners were responsible to it both legally, via impeachment, and politically. In Polish conditions, however, the separation of powers entailed the establishment of a reasonably coherent executive and a properly functioning judicial system, rather than the safeguarding of the legislature and judiciary from the influence of the crown, as it came to mean in the British world. The need for an executive power was explained to sceptical provincial nobles by the 7th article of the Constitution. The most perfect government cannot exist or last without an effectual executive power. The happiness of the nation depends on just laws, but the good effects of laws flow only from their execution. Experience has taught us that the long neglect of this essential part of government has overwhelmed Poland with disasters. According to the provisions of the 7th article, the king could not be held personally responsible for his actions. He could select the ministers in the significantly named Strażpraw, translated by Bukati as Council of Inspection, but literally meaning guard of the laws, and looking back to Plato. Subject to a minister's countersignature, the king's will was to prevail in its decisions. Within the legislature, however, the roles of the Senate and the monarch were subordinated to the elected representatives of the nobility. They were called representatives of the entire nation, which was a key provision inexplicably omitted by Bukati from his translation. They were not mere delegates of their electors. This meant that they could not be bound by instructions from their local assemblies or seigneurs. Although qualified majorities were required for new laws and taxes, no longer would the same be bound or paralysed by the liberal veto. Effectively, a stronger executive was established in partnership with a stronger legislature. The ideological compromise between monarchism and republicanism, embodied in the law on government, was part of a wider political compromise between the king and the more enlightened of his political opponents. After the 3rd of May 1791, as we saw earlier, their combined efforts were turned towards convincing of tens of thousands of nobles to endorse the Constitution in the clearest possible manner, and not to believe malcontents' allegations that Polish liberty had been betrayed. The arguments employed followed those in the text of the Constitution itself. The Commonwealth, it was claimed, stood on the edge of an abyss and could only be rescued by a determined show of national unity in defence of the Constitution, which was a miracle of divine providence. There's little that was intrinsically liberal in this idea. Indeed, virtually no space was accorded to legitimate opposition. Nevertheless, pro-constitutional discourse did contain an important strain that praised orderly freedom, rządna wolność, contrasted with the aristocratic anarchy that had allegedly characterised the past, and brought the Commonwealth not only to a disorderly condition that was inseparable from free states, but to the very brink of national catastrophe. Part of the new emphasis on orderliness came through the exclusion of landless nobles from full political participation in the Senate. Reverend Hugo Kołłąta and other leading reformers were edging towards a situation where all inhabitants of the Commonwealth enjoyed personal liberty, but only the propertied, be they the owners of urban or of landed property, actively participated in the political process. The linking of active political rights to property qualifications was a familiar solution to 19th century statehood. For the moment, burghers would only elect 24 plenipotentiaries, who would advise the Sejm on economic and urban matters. The Sejm was more generous, though, with individual liberties. The ancient noble personal immunity from arrest without trial, dating back to the early 15th century, neminem captivabimus nus nisi jure victum, was extended to burghers by the Sejm. A later administrative decision encompassed town-dwelling Jews within the scope of that privilege. The first step towards the personal freedom of the insurgent peasants was the deliberately vague declaration that this agricultural class of people, the most numerous in the nation, consequently forming the most considerable part of its force, from whose hands flows the source of our riches, we receive under the protection of the national law and government. That at least implied that the peasants formed an esteemed part of the nation. Compared to the storm tide of noble republicanism that threatened to submerge both the monarchy and the Catholic clergy at the outset of the Polish Revolution of 1788 to 92, both throne and altar made a startling comeback during the second half of the same. I would argue that they did so because uncrowned national sovereignty, exercised by the same with so little restraint in its first year, had shown the potential for, as one pamphleteer put it, the despotism of the Commonwealth. It was spokesmen for throne and altar who made most forcefully the case that the liberty and property of both individual citizens and of corporations, such as the Roman Catholic clergy, could best be safeguarded not by an omnipotent legislature as the executor of the national, which is to say the noble will, but by a balance between an effective legislature and a coherent executive headed by the monarch. This is a position much more akin to liberalism than to republicanism. I would therefore argue that the polemics of the Polish Revolution contributed significantly, but very briefly, to the development of a Polish school of liberal political thought. As the question of national independence took overwhelming priority over all others after 1792, so a renewed version of republicanism, socially and confessionally inclusive, insurrectionary, and later romantic republicanism, proved itself far more relevant, far more attractive to most politically active Polish patriots than were the concerns of some statesmen and thinkers to balance the claims of civil and political liberty. During the last few years, it has become much more fashionable to talk about the republican principles of the Commonwealth of many faiths, languages and nations than about throne and altar. The political case for a rehabilitation of the Polish republican tradition is a very attractive one. Its idealism, its patriotism, may be contrasted with the charges of egotism and facile cosmopolitanism levelled at neo-liberal expectations of humanity. It can also be presented as a substantial and genuinely Polish contribution to a shared European and North American democratic and republican heritage. As historians have come to abandon the scheme of monarchical absolutism as the normal path to modernity, so the patchwork of medieval and early modern collective privileges and liberties is held up as the root of later expressions of the universal rights of man and citizen. Republican ideas of liberty help to make sense of such particular liberties. However, this growing tendency among historians of the Commonwealth, which in general I regard as a very positive development, makes it more difficult fully to understand and appreciate the merits of the Constitution of the 3rd of May 1791. I would argue that we should excavate and appreciate not only the Republican, but also the liberal credentials of the Constitution of the 3rd of May. Now, you may well ask why. Liberalism is attacked from both right and left. In the United States, Great Britain, perhaps in Canada as well, it is not unreasonably associated with runaway political correctness. In the Islamic world, liberalism is associated with a moral vacuum. In the western and southern parts of continental Europe, qualified by the pejorative prefix neo, economic liberalism is bracketed with neoconservatism. And of course, both social and economic liberalism are attacked in Poland. Those who do call themselves liberals are often extremely illiberal towards those who disagree with them. Few words are travestied as frequently as liberalism. Liberalism is a political tradition that in its classical form stretches from Benjamin Constant through John Stuart Mill to Isaiah Berlin and beyond. It crystallized in reaction to the excesses of Jacobinism and Bonapartism and was later refreshed by the challenges posed by fascist and communist totalitarianisms. An opposition to utopias and a realistic appreciation of human fallibility and diversity is one of its salient features. Liberalism, while a 19th century term, has 18th century roots. The principal contribution comes from Montesquieu's reclassification of forms of government into moderate and despotic. Monarchies and republics can degenerate into despotisms if delicate balances of power are upset, and the functions of power, legislative, executive, and judicial, fall into the same hands. In a despotism, life and property are insecure from the whim of the despot. Everything is permeated by fear. This is the very opposite of individual, civil, and negative liberty, that tranquility of spirit that comes from personal security. Such liberty can be experienced in any moderate government, whether monarchic, republican, or mixed. The liberty associated with republics, the freedom of citizens to rule themselves collectively, is no guarantee that individual liberty will be upheld. These convictions can be found among the various treatises on law, politics, and society written in later 18th century Poland. The two concepts of liberty discussed by Isaiah Berlin can already be found in the distinction between civil freedom and political freedom, made by 18th century Polish theorists such as the Reverend Hugo Hołątaj, Reverend Wincenty Skrzetuski, Reverend Hieronim Strojnowski, Józef Pawlikowski, obviously very dear to my heart, Jan Ferdinand Knox, and Józef Wybicki. Kołłątaj, writing in 1789, is quite explicit that the two do not necessarily coincide. In a bad government, even under a republic, it is possible to be a slave. In a good government, even under a monarch, it is possible to be free. The reaction of French liberals against revolutionary excesses was also anticipated in Poland. The brothers Stanisław August and Michał Jerzy Poniatowski agreed that of all nations, the English were the securest in their individual enjoyment of liberty and property, and concurred that by 1791, the liberty of the French Revolution was descending into a form of popular tyranny. Such views were by no means universal. Some Polish Republican thinkers, especially Stanisław Staszic, echoed Rousseau's rigorous subordination of the individual to the general or national good. During the Kościuszko insurrection, so-called Polish Jacobins advocated following the emergency measures taken by the Committee of Public Safety in France. In the mid-20th century, the origins of the terror or totalitarian democracy were sometimes traced through Rousseau, through him to the ancient republican idea of liberty. However, the last 2 decades have seen a remarkable rehabilitation of early modern republicanism. That is, the type of republicanism before the French Revolution. English-speaking historians of ideas, led by Quentin Skinner, have pointed out that for early modern republican theorists, the chief purpose of collective, civil, or positive liberty was to safeguard individual political or negative liberty from overthrow by a monarch, from a tyrant. Liberty is not merely the absence of actual coercion, but the absence of the possibility of coercion. And that was only possible in a free form of government, a res publica, in which the citizens shared in political power. In other words, liberty in the singular was an overarching protection for all the particular individual liberties and privileges in the plural enjoyed by the citizens. Such was also the deeply held conviction of the vast majority of the citizens of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Time to conclude. Why celebrate the 3rd of May 1791? We shall never know what might have been had by some miracle Europe's first constitution not been overthrown by Russia and a few malcontent nobles, and had the Commonwealth not been partitioned. Suitably amended, it might still be in force, much venerated like the American Constitution. We cannot know. We may, however, reasonably judge that the transformations initiated by the Polish Revolution would have produced a far better future for the Commonwealth's peoples than the one they experienced in the 19th and 20th century. In 1791, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth embarked on a path encompassing extensive individual liberty and religious toleration for all inhabitants, a gradual widening of the franchise, local self-government, a closer union between the Polish Crown and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, freedom of trade, labour and settlement, and the rule of law. From the Republican tradition came the ethos of political participation and service for the common good. The will of the nation, represented in the same, would have been sovereign, but not despotic or arbitrary. This was because of the balance between legislative, executive, and judicial powers. If this system can also be called liberal, then this would have been a conservative rather than a radical kind of liberalism. It was certainly not secularist, and the assurance of peace and protection to people of all faiths was not intended to undermine the dominant Catholic religion. The discourse of the 3rd of May Revolution was reassuringly traditional. The requisite miracle did not occur, at least not in 1792. We may speculate that if the angel of death had visited not the Emperor Leopold II or the Swedish King Gustavus III, but the Empress Catherine II, that things may have turned out rather differently. The 3rd of May became a testament rather than a blueprint. The Constitution testifies to the vitality of the old Commonwealth. It proves the ability of the Polish nation of the late 18th century to diagnose its own ills, to select appropriate remedies from home and abroad, and to renew itself. Contrary to the propaganda and the historiography of the partitioning powers, and contrary to an unfortunate tendency among some Poles to confuse constructive criticism with self-flagellation, Old Poland did not die because she was incurably anarchic. Yes, she had fallen ill, but she was slain because she showed unmistakable signs of returning to health. This is not the occasion to consider how well or ill the independence regained between 1989 and 1991 has been used. What I will say is that the external circumstances remain extremely favourable, probably better than they have been for 300 years. The opportunity remains to build a Rzeczpospolita that, like the Commonwealth envisaged by the Constitution of the 3rd of May, draws wisely and discriminately, both on Polish traditions and on the best of what the Western world has to offer. A Rzeczpospolita which assures its citizens that orderly freedom, rządna wolność, in which they may realise their potential. A Rzeczpospolita of its citizens, by its citizens, and for its citizens.